I want to pick up a comment made by Earl B, who fleshes out the details of Martin Heal, who was a National Front member in the 1970s and then went on to work for UKIP and to be Nigel Farage's campaign manager when Farage stood in Thanet South. Now, Earl B says the UKIP chairman in Thanet South constituency, where Nigel Farage was the party's candidate at the general election, has admitted being a former member of the National Front. Martin Heal told the BBC it was really depressing to be reminded that he was a member of the racist and neo-fascist National Front in the 1970s. I obviously regret what I did. Of course, you should always beware of anybody who uses the word obviously. If it's obvious, you don't need to say it. If it isn't obvious, it's a misused word. Subsequently, Heal spent 20 years as a Conservative Party activist before joining UKIP about 10 years ago. He's now a UKIP county councillor in Kent. After the BBC's World at One broadcast a report highlighting Heal's background, Suzanne Evans, UKIP's deputy chair, told the programme that media coverage of UKIP was unfair and that the BBC never covered former National Front members in other parties. She claimed that in 1 week in April, 17 Labour, Tory or Lib Dem councillors nationwide were arrested, charged or convicted, and another 13 were accused of racism, sexism or homophobia, but only one of the cases was reported in the national media. A year's resolution you can actually keep. Well, I think that's very... I think it's very interesting. The point is that the issue is not whether the media is being fair to UKIP or Reform UK, but whether or not UKIP or Reform UK has genuinely got racism in its ranks or has genuinely got people in its ranks who were members of the National Front or are members of the National Front or these other extremist organisations. The answer is yes. Whether people are members of the National Front in other parties is another matter. But it is quite clear to me that UKIP was a party that had racists and extremists among its members, mostly working in back rooms, mostly working out of sight of the public, but definitely influential in the way the party worked. And the argument put forward by Suzanne Evans is simply spurious. And it's a sort of whataboutism. It's a logical fallacy of some form, and it's tiresome to have this this issue unresolved. The fact is, UKIP definitely has this background and definitely tolerated these people as long as they kept undercover, as long as they weren't revealed to the public, as long as the newspapers didn't find out. If they did, then they were pushed to one side, and Farage said he didn't realise, he didn't know. Well, he knew about Martin Heal because Martin Heal was his managed his election, and I think the question must be asked: are there the same sort of people in Reform UK? And has anyone done any investigation into that? It's not about has anybody asked Reform UK. Has anybody gone into Reform UK and looked around in detail? Because that's the issue. And it wasn't until I went into UKIP and looked around in detail that I could say with certainty that UKIP tolerated racism. And I blew the whistle when there was an obvious event. Otherwise, I think, there is room for minor parties like UKIP, like Reform UK, as there is room for news organisations like GB News and organisations on the left like Momentum. That gives us a nice scope for real and genuine politics. The idea that everything has to be Conservative or Labour or Lib Dem is simply absurd, and proportional representation would give us the opportunity for people to vote for individuals who are committed to a particular view, maybe a particular niche political mindset, but at least we know who we would be voting for. It's then up to them, once they're in Parliament, once they're in Westminster, to negotiate a deal with the bigger parties so that they are in alliance. So the broad church is something that happens after an election rather than before an election. At the moment, when you vote for Labour or Conservative, you don't really know what you're getting, because these people are hiding behind a manifesto that they don't necessarily endorse. They're reluctantly behind that manifesto because it's the only way for them to get into Parliament. We need to change the system. But equally, we need to be a little bit more honest. And I'm not convinced that Nigel Farage is necessarily being upfront about the makeup of Reform UK, as I'm certainly not convinced he was upfront about the makeup of UKIP. That is the issue. And it's not about being unfair to UKIP. UKIP's a political party. It's open to investigation and to observation. And if people didn't do their journalistic work, then that's their problem. I certainly did everything within my power to find out what the truth was, whether or not all UKIPers were racist. They aren't, and they weren't. But there was a body of racism within the party, and the senior party membership tolerated that racism, as was demonstrated by the way Farage tolerated David Coburn when he was unbelievably abusive to Humza Yousaf. That is the reality.